welcome to the latest edition of the Sports Pro podcast. I'm your host, Tom Bassam, and this week it's just one colleague with me, but it is a very special colleague. He's got his own podcast these days. He's, of course, our motorsport writer, Cian Brittle. Hello, Cian. How are you?
Hi, Tom. Thank you for having me on. It's a nice little crossover episode, this, I think.
Yeah, I think that's what they call it in the industry, a crossover episode. It's great for marketing, apparently. But yeah, if you weren't aware, Cian presents the Mike's Out podcast with the rest of the Black Book team, which is a bi-weekly pod discussing all things motorsport business. And that's why I got Cian on to discuss all things motorsport business today. We're coming into this at a kind of pretty crucial point of the F1 season. F1 is back. We had the latest Grand Prix in the Netherlands, won by Lando Norris in quite impressive fashion, I think, in the end. Would you say, Cian?
Yeah, over 22 seconds. So pretty crushing victory over Max Verstappen at his home race, no less.
Is that a race? Verstappen's won that race for 2 or 3 years in a row, right?
Every Dutch Grand Prix until the weekend was won by Max Verstappen since it came back onto the calendar.
Well, there you go. Probably not great for the home fans, but nice one for us because, it's British and that. Right. It's not just F1 we're going to talk about. There's a couple of other agenda items today, but F1 is the main thing. And one of the reasons I wanted to get Cian on is because there is no better person to talk about the off-track storylines that have dominated. I'm guessing this is just now past the halfway point in the season, right?
Just past, yeah. But I mean, off the back of the summer break, so
yeah.
It feels like quite a nice mid-season point.
Right. So I wanted to get your 3 biggest off-track storylines from this season, Cian. I mean, you can go in any order you want to, from third biggest to first biggest, or either way around. I don't really mind. Whichever you want to do. Where do you want to start?
Well, we can work our way through it. I mean, I think it's probably good to start with a story that actually hasn't affected anything this season so far as we await.
A story that hasn't affected anything isn't the greatest start to a thing that we want people to listen to, but let's keep going.
Well, it has a very 2025 relevance rather than this season, and that is obviously Lewis Hamilton's move to Ferrari,
which I think that is fair enough.
Is fairly seismic
in
terms of the most successful F1 driver of all time moving to the most successful F1 team of all time. It seems like a perfect match. Obviously quite a surprise when it was announced. I think a lot of people had come to the point maybe that they thought Lewis Hamilton was going to stay at Mercedes for the rest of his career and that's where he was going to retire. But I think the allure of Ferrari every driver wants to drive in red, and clearly Lewis Hamilton wants to end his career there. And I think it's going to be exciting watching Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari. When it was announced, Ferrari's share price skyrocketed by 10%, which roughly equates to about $7 billion.
It'd be nice to have that kind of level of input on any company, wouldn't it? I mean, do you reckon you're worth 10% to the Black Book share price?
Well, I mean, if I was ever to leave Black Book, which God forbid, I doubt it would cause that seismic of an impact.
Not sure which index we're listed on, actually, if we are at all. I should probably know that as an employee of the company. But I'd put your worth at 10% Black Book, Cian. So
thank you, Tom.
But you're not wrong. That's massive. I guess as well for Ferrari, they are the most successful F1 team of all time, but they've not been the most successful F1 team of recent times.
No.
And maybe they needed a 10% share bump.
It's very true. I think, obviously, probably some fallow years, you could say, for Ferrari. The Michael Schumacher years were the most recent heyday, but it seems they just haven't been able to click. They've been missing that ingredient that would take them on to championship level again. I think, obviously, Sebastian Vettel came over, a 4-time world champion, to Ferrari, and he couldn't get the team there. They have probably one of the most promising drivers in F1 at the moment in Charles Leclerc, currently driving for them, arguably probably the quickest over one lap, but it's still just not quite coming together for the team. I think having Fred Vasseur there now as team principal, things are starting to move in the right direction. They started this season quite well, but have dropped off a little bit as McLaren's resurgence has become very apparent. I think Lewis going to Ferrari will surely bring a certain standard with him that will surely lift the team. How much remains to be seen. We're still waiting to see, what Red Bull and McLaren are going to do for the rest of this season and whether Ferrari can actually catch up to them before next year. I don't think they will until 2025, but I think 2025 is a new year. And then obviously 2026 is the new regulations when everything will change. I'm interested to see how it develops, but obviously when Lewis Hamilton went to Mercedes, he moved the year before a big regulation change, and we saw how that worked out. So I think there's quite a nice comparison there. It remains to be seen whether it will pay off in the same way.
And like, it's fair to say a strong Ferrari is good for Formula One. We could probably even kind of wind it back a little bit further and explain why it is that Ferrari have such a heightened status within the sport. Like, they are literally paid by Formula One to stay in the competition, right?
They are. They do have a legacy payment, as it's known, basically just because of their historical significance to Formula One. They've raced in every season of the Formula One World Championship. A lot of people, when they think of a racing car, they think of a red car. It's synonymous with everything that is F1. I'm not 100% sure on the exact payment. I'm not sure if it's ever been officially revealed, but it's a substantial amount of money that they're getting every season as part of the Concord Agreement, which is the agreement by which all teams agree to race in Formula One. And that's a big part of Formula One. Ferrari are a massive part of Formula One. And I think it will continue to be that way as Formula One grows.
For sure. And I mean, I guess the thing about that arrangement is that Ferrari are almost a marketing tool for Formula One in the same way that Formula One is a marketing tool for pretty much every OEM that is in the series. But if we're talking about marketing, I think probably the real marketing here is the lead driver that is moving over to Ferrari and his ability to sell not just a sport, but whatever team he is working for. Like, what kind of impact do you think this will have for the Ferrari brand and also for the Lewis Hamilton brand?
Well, obviously outside of, Ferrari being itself a massive commercial brand within Formula One, Lewis Hamilton is obviously a huge commercial asset to whichever team he drives for. When he was at Mercedes, well, he obviously still is at Mercedes, but he was a massive part of Tommy Hilfiger coming on board to sponsor Mercedes. So he's obviously got this draw for brands that want to be attached to him. I think, will have a similar impact at Ferrari. Ferrari are the most financially successful Formula One team in terms of valuation. It's not a case of Lewis Hamilton leaving Mercedes and they're going to drop off, because they're a financial behemoth as well. But I think as an asset and brands wanting to be attached to drivers, of course, Lewis Hamilton is case in point. He is the main driver within Formula One, in my opinion, in terms of having that external impact as well. I think Lewis Hamilton is probably the only driver, I think, that extends beyond Formula One in terms of having a social and cultural impact elsewhere. So I think having that and combining that with Ferrari, I think, can only be a good thing for both sides.
The sponsorship element is really interesting, actually, because the Tommy Hilfiger deal is personal too. Now, whether or not that gets carried over once he leaves, it will be one thing, but you wouldn't be surprised to see another major fashion house, maybe an Italian one, jump on board and see that as an opportunity to grow their profile using Lewis Hamilton, but also the revenues of F1 and the British driver.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think Lewis Hamilton has recently been announced as an ambassador for Dior. So you've got that link with fashion that is obviously so big to Lewis Hamilton. I agree. I think we could see an Italian fashion house maybe come on board with Ferrari to support them. The Tommy Hilfiger deal with Mercedes is actually ending at the end of this year. I mean, the draw of Lewis Hamilton in that particular sector is obviously massive.
I guess as well, like with Hamilton, you're right, he has that superstar status. He's also coming towards the end of his career. Do you think like this is a bit of a last chance saloon in terms of his window as an athlete? Maybe not as a personality, but as an athlete.
I don't know whether it's last chance saloon. I think we're seeing it with Fernando Alonso. He's still racing in Formula One at 41, 42 years old, and he's still just as good as ever. He doesn't have the car to show it, but he's still competing at the top level. Lewis Hamilton hasn't dropped off at all, really, in my opinion. I mean, he's won 2 races this season. He obviously had a couple of tough years with Mercedes, but this season he's looked back to his best. He's winning races again. I think moving to Ferrari, it's a bit of a swan song. It's a nice way to end his career, but I don't think it's last chance saloon. I think worst case scenario, he ends his career as a Ferrari driver, and I think that alone is a big enough story. He may win an 8th world title with Ferrari, which is obviously what he's going there to do, but at the end of the day, he will be able to say that he's a Ferrari driver.
And getting out your crystal ball for a second, and I know this isn't really the usual focus of this podcast, but do you think there's a better chance that he gets that 8th title by moving to Ferrari, or would he have been perhaps better off remaining at Mercedes?
I think he probably wouldn't have expected Mercedes to be quite as good as they are this season. But at the same time, nobody can know what will happen after those 2026 regulations come in. It is a lot of guesswork, and it's just trusting that the systems in place at the team you are driving for are successful enough to put that team in a position to compete. And I think he did it with Mercedes. He got obviously very lucky that Mercedes produced one of the most dominant cars of all time. What's to say that Ferrari don't do something similar in 2026? I don't think anybody knows. It's guesswork. And I think that just draw of being able to drive for Ferrari alone was probably what did it for Lewis.
Story number 2, Cian. Where are you going with this?
It's probably good to mention a storyline that has dominated this season, especially the start of this season when allegations came out around Christian Horner and Red Bull. I think just before the start of the season at the Bahrain Grand Prix, a story emerged that he was under investigation for alleged inappropriate behaviour. He denied those claims. He was then cleared at the end of February. At the time, a BBC Sport report claimed it was inappropriate behaviour of a controlling nature, I believe was the word. Obviously, at the Bahrain Grand Prix, we were treated to a united front by Christian Horner and his wife, Jerry Halliwell. And then a file containing alleged texts and images was leaked to the entire F1 paddock.
And all of X.
And as well, all of X as well. But the contents were never officially verified. The complainant then obviously appealed. This was dismissed just a couple of weeks ago. So it's felt like this has obviously bubbled under the surface for a lot of this season. And we're starting to see maybe the effects of that on the Red Bull team. We've seen obviously the dominant win for Lando Norris at the weekend, Red Bull 22 seconds off the pace. And a lot of that is probably just down to how good Max Verstappen is that he was even able to finish second. We've seen Adrian Newey leave Red Bull as well. Rumours were that this was due to a breakdown in his relationship with Christian Horner. Again, never confirmed. We don't know where Newey's going, but we have seen a few departures from Red Bull this season, and also obviously Red Bull's significant drop-off in pace, having been the dominant team for the last few seasons. There were also rumours that Helmut Marko might be exiting the team, who's obviously been a long-time advisor for Red Bull, but this led to Max Verstappen threatening to leave himself if Helmut Marko did depart the team. So it's obviously not been a very happy time at Red Bull, and I think we're starting to see that maybe leak across into their on-track performances.
Yeah, I mean, look, the allegations against Christian Horner obviously denied strenuously, and he was cleared by an internal investigation. The sympathies obviously go out to the complainant, who's clearly had a hard time. But the impact of this, I think, reaches well beyond Red Bull and goes into lots of avenues, really, because if you're pulling away the strings of it, where does Adrian Newey go next? One of the sort of most innovative engineers in Formula One history, you'd have to say. Has the potential to land kind of in a lot of places. There's a lot of speculation around that. I think I read something recently that he was potentially going to be working on a kind of freelancey basis for Red Bull still, but I don't know how much of that was true. Obviously, there's the stuff with Verstappen as well, where Max Verstappen's dad, Jos Verstappen, was quite clearly unhappy about the way that the team was being managed and said to be unhappy with Christian Horner personally. As he said, Helmut Marko threatening to leave. It's amazing how Red Bull have gone from looking like they were about to dominate Formula One for seasons to come and were streets ahead in terms of where their car was, to almost having to like brand manage their reputation a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were such a well-oiled machine. I think even back when Mercedes were dominating the sport, you felt like they had a weekend in them where everything could go wrong. Their car was so good that it didn't matter. They would win most of the races anyway. But I don't think we've ever seen that same thing from Red Bull. They've always seemed so in control. Every strategy call has seemed correct. The car has obviously been perfect for the last few years. It seemed just quite ominous for the rest of the field with how good Red Bull have been. So I think this change has been quite significant and quite noticeable for those reasons, because it's not the same team anymore. Cracks are beginning to show. You feel like behind the scenes, it just doesn't obviously seem right. And there was a bit of a power struggle that emerged off the back of this between the two sides of Red Bull's ownership, 51% owned by having Thai owners and 49% Austrian owners. It all just seems to have spilled over into the actual performances of the team now. And I think the most noticeable thing for me was when Lando Norris overtook Max Verstappen at the weekend. Max didn't fight it, which is so unlike him. He's always sort of on the edge, sometimes over the limit in terms of how he defends certain drivers. But at the weekend, he couldn't do anything. He was helpless to Lando Norris overtaking him. And I think that was the big thing for me in terms of where Red Bull currently are and how far they've actually fallen off the back of this.
In some ways, it's obviously not a great time for Red Bull, but in some ways it's kind of good for F1. There's definitely some narratives, and this is something that you guys covered on the Mike's Out podcast, is when Formula One isn't competitive, people tune out. After first handful of Grand Prix, it really looked like it wasn't going to be competitive. But whilst it's obviously not been Red Bull's kind of decline, has been everyone else's gain, and also or maybe in some ways the series gain too.
It's definitely been the series gain. I remember recording our F1 season preview for Mike's Out, and we were all just quite nervous about how potentially dominant Red Bull were going to be again. So I think after the first few races, and it appeared to be going that way, I think, yes, a lot of people probably did start to tune out of the season because it just seemed like more of the same. It was going to be another Verstappen-led Red Bull dominant season. But then it all kind of changed. We saw teams starting to close the gap. We've now seen McLaren jump ahead of Red Bull in the pecking order. And I think in terms of on-track competitiveness, Formula One hasn't been this good in quite a while. Obviously, the race at the weekend was quite dominant for Lando Norris and McLaren, but there's been a streak of races where the on-track battles have been close and exciting. It feels like there's many different drivers who can fight for wins. It feels like this is happening at just the right time for Formula One in terms of recapturing people's imagination in a way, especially for viewership and audiences and attendances. Everything seems to be pointing in the right direction, especially in the US, which is a huge market for F1, obviously been a big focus for them. I felt like the US audience was maybe switching off F1 a little bit in terms of, well, just because of how dominant Red Bull have been recently. But
has that played out in the numbers with the viewership on ESPN?
Absolutely. I mean, they've had a great streak of races which are all over 1 million viewers recently, which I think hasn't been the case for quite a while in F1 in terms of...
Maybe since the Verstappen-Hamilton series where they were really going at it toe for toe, or was it even then?
Well, even then, that was still, I think, quite early in F1's time in America. I think they were rarely getting over 1 million viewers, I think, in 2021. Whereas now in 2024, I think we've had 7 or 8 straight races of over 1 million viewers in the US. It's still obviously small compared to the audiences that NASCAR gets, but it's definitely going in the right direction for the series.
And we've got more US races to come, right?
We do. We've obviously already had the Miami Grand Prix, which I think got over 3 million viewers in the US, which is massive for Formula One. But we've still got the race at the Circuit of the Americas in Austin, Texas, and of course the Las Vegas Grand Prix, which had its first ever race last year. I mean, a massive event, kind of unlike anything I've ever seen in Formula One. But yeah, I'm excited to see how that one goes this year, having had sort of that first race to bed in and sort of establish itself as a Formula One race.
Plus you got the Mexican Grand Prix as well, which is I guess is a similar same time zone and a chance for American fans to watch in prime time too. So yeah, it does kind of bode well for the viewership there. And like going back into the Red Bull story here a little bit, is the other element of this, I sort of briefly mentioned Adrian Newey, is the other element of this, he could potentially land at another team and again tilt that balance of competitiveness.
Well, yeah, if the rumours are to be believed, he is potentially going to Aston Martin. I'm not sure how certain that is. He seems to be linked to every single team on the grid, but also why wouldn't he be? He is the greatest engineer that's ever lived in F1. Any team would be happy to have him. I'm sure Lawrence Stroll would throw an obscene amount of money at Adrian Newey to make sure that he was involved with Aston Martin and bringing that team up towards the front of the grid. Obviously, there was quite a few rumours about maybe Adrian Newey going to Ferrari, obviously sort of centred in that romantic idea of having the best engineer with the best driver, with the best team, having that sort of link up between Newey, Hamilton and Ferrari, just it all seemed to be right. But I think maybe that was a bit too focused on maybe romanticising it rather than the reality of him obviously not wanting to really leave the UK and where he's based. So I think I could see him ending up at Aston Martin. But again, it remains to be seen which direction he goes into. But I think he will stay in F1.
Mm. F1's a kind of unique sport in that the off-track stuff is so linked to what happens on it and the sort of changing fortunes of how the whole thing works. That it's crazy. You get a story really about what is team infighting and executive departures, but that can have such a profound influence across the whole series. And I guess it's a small paddock. There's only 10 teams. How it all unfurls is, I've always found that fascinating.
It's such a tightly knit, small paddock that anything that happens just has a knock-on effect everywhere else. I mean, chances are, if you work in F1, you're going to end up working for multiple teams. You see team principals jumping from team to team. Obviously, James Vowles at Williams came across from Mercedes. Fred Vasseur at Ferrari came across from Sauber. And they've got so much longer histories in the sport. Everybody sort of affects everybody in Formula One in the way that it works. It's quite a weird, funny world in that way.
Must be fun to report on. I guess moving on to point 3, this is maybe an illustration of all of that.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And we spoke about the importance of the US market, and it seemed that there was almost an open goal waiting for Formula One when Andretti declared their interest in joining the series. It felt like everything was lining up for that proper US-based team to join the series. Obviously, Haas are American-owned, but they're predominantly based in the UK and also potentially not very good. But having Andretti, a massive name in American motorsport, joining Formula One, it seemed like the stars were aligning. Obviously, their initial bid was accepted by the FIA, but then on commercial grounds, Formula One decided that they weren't going to pursue it. They weren't going ahead with it. They did leave the door open for a potential resubmission for 2028, specifically with General Motors as a power unit supplier. Obviously, having Andretti and General Motors together, again, seemed like another surefire thing.
Can you just explain that link for us, actually? So with Andretti and General Motors, was that always the plan? With General Motors, was that all part of the same entry from the get-go?
Yeah, it was the case from the beginning. Andretti's initial bid was submitted specifically with General Motors alongside them. Obviously, a massive car manufacturer in the US.
We're talking about the owner of Ford. It's literally the US car owner.
Literally. So the Andretti bid was going to be done with Cadillac as the supporting brand under the General Motors umbrella. And it just felt as though with General Motors support, there was surely no way Formula One could say no. And yet we're here now with Andretti obviously quite unhappy about the fact that they've been denied entry. Formula One can point to the fact that it's not a full denial because they've left the door open. But I think personally that is potentially because when the 2026 regulations come in, there's also going to be a renegotiation of the 2026 Concord Agreement. Now, within that contract, there is a fee, I guess, that a new team would have to pay to join the series, which is currently set at $200 million. Now, the Concord Agreement was signed before Formula One had this huge boom in popularity. Obviously, we've spoken at length about the Drive to Survive effect before, but that popularity boost has seen, obviously, valuations in Formula One soar. Suddenly that $200 million entry fee doesn't seem quite right. It seems like a very cut price deal to get involved in Formula One.
I think it was Forbes released their annual F1 team valuations report, and as you mentioned, Ferrari topped that. Weren't they coming in at a couple of $1 billion?
Yeah, just over $2 billion, which is a fair amount of money.
So to pay $200 million to get into a series where your valuation is almost immediately going to be somewhere near the £1 billion mark, right? $1 billion mark, because I think even the bottom end of the market is well over 900.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a powerhouse OEM here and a well-known racing brand in Andretti too. Yeah, but that does seem to be a bit of an oversight in this whole process.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to blame Formula One for obviously having a low entry fee, because I don't think anyone could have predicted the popularity boom that they've experienced. I think it is maybe a little bit cheeky to reject Andretti and wait for the Concord Agreement to be renegotiated. I've heard rumours the new fee could be anywhere upwards of $600 million. That gets distributed throughout all the teams, because obviously if an 11th team joins the grid, then suddenly you've got 11 teams splitting commercial revenues instead of 10, so everyone's revenues will drop slightly. I just don't see how an Andretti General Motors combined bid wouldn't benefit the series, in my opinion, in terms of what it would add to the series overall. Having that US-based team for a US audience to get behind, it just seems like such a surefire win. So I'll be interested to see how this progresses moving forward, because I don't think Andretti are going to go quietly. They still set up a UK facility based right in the middle of Silverstone, right after they were rejected. They're definitely going to be, I'd say, noisy neighbours for all the F1 teams. Most of them are based around that area of the country. And we've also obviously seen the US Department of Justice getting involved now, which seems like a fairly crazy step for that to be happening in Formula One. But obviously, Andretti feel as though Liberty Media have infringed on US antitrust laws by not letting them into the series. So that's going to be another interesting part of this whole saga.
No, for sure. Going back to the sort of Andretti brand and the General Motors side of this, you're right. Like the potential for a major boost in in interest in the US market. Like if you sort of suddenly start telling Americans that there's a Cadillac team driving around the most popular motorsport series in the world, and like that, it will probably be a well-financed Cadillac team. That's going to generate huge fan eyeballs, but also sponsor interest. ESPN's rights deals suddenly might look a little bit cheaper, especially if the TV ratings keep on going in the direction that they are, and the sport stays competitive on track. Aside from the sort of the petty squabbles of team principals and owners who perhaps don't want to see their central F1 fee being diluted by the entry of an 11th team, let's try and play rival team principal here. What are the other arguments against it happening?
I think there's certainly an argument to be had that would they be competitive once they join the grid? I think it's tricky to know. They were trying to join the grid as early as next season, which I think F1 executives felt there was no way that they could produce a competitive car in that short amount of time. They initially wanted to join the grid without General Motors support. It should be noted they wanted to do 2 years with a customer supply before General Motors was officially ready to have its own F1 engine. It's obviously an extremely long process. The F1 engines are very, very complicated. So there was an argument there that maybe the bid wasn't as fully formed as it could have been. And I think that's another reason that F1 left the door open. They said, well, once General Motors are ready, you can come back to us with a full bid, a full customer supply engine from General Motors, instead of taking an existing team's engine supply. It was rumoured it was going to be Alpine, but no one knows what's going on behind the scenes at that team at the moment. They might even be stopping their engine program altogether. So I think all of these things kind of contributed to maybe the Andretti bid not being as watertight as it could have been. But on the flip side, I think that US focus, as we've talked about, is in my eyes a crucial thing. And you've mentioned the viewership going up in the country. The US market responds when the US is focused on. I think it's always been the case. You can look at the 3 million viewers that the Miami Grand Prix got. That's far and away the most viewed race of the season. When the US market is at the centre, the US market responds.
Yeah, and that's the reason why they not only decided to put another Grand Prix, and a Grand Prix that the series itself owns, which is quite rare. Like the Las Vegas Grand Prix setup is unique almost within the sport, in that Liberty Media basically controls the whole thing. Now, look, it hasn't quite hit the mark with Vegas locally in the way it wants to, but we're about to see this. We'll see the second race quite soon. From my perspective, it seems like there's the will there to make that event work.
Absolutely. I think there's the will from both sides. And I think obviously there was a lot of talk about local Vegas residents responding quite poorly to the event. And I think that's to be expected. They're not used to that level of disruption in a very busy city. I think after a few years, they'll probably start to get more used to the disruption that comes with the Las Vegas Grand Prix taking place. I mean, Monaco shuts down for Monaco Grand Prix weekend, but that's part of the culture at this point in Monaco. It's obviously such a famous and historic race, whereas Las Vegas is obviously very, very new. It's only had one race. On the whole, I'd say it was probably a moderate success in terms of what it was and the logistical effort to actually put it on. And as you mentioned, entirely promoted by Formula One itself and Liberty Media, which is the first time they've ever done that. They sort of did it in Miami. They sort of worked with a promoter. Miami obviously has, on its third race this season, has improved massively from that first year. So I expect to see probably a similar progression for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. And I think the confidence they've gained from doing what they did in Miami and then obviously going completely by themselves on Las Vegas, I wouldn't be surprised to see them do that elsewhere moving forward.
Definitely seems like the direction of travel. The final thing on Andretti, I think worth mentioning, is the politics behind it and the split between Formula One as a series and the FIA, the governing body. The FIA clearly very keen to get Andretti and really waved this through, invited teams to apply. Where's that at now, that Formula One FIA relationship, and what's the FIA's stance on the Andretti situation?
It's an interesting one. I think the FIA and F1 relationship has been probably rocky, if I was to be polite, in recent years. FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem has been quite outspoken on a fair few occasions, of which Formula One has obviously taken issue with that at points. I think they even potentially threatened legal action with Ben Sulayem over his comments about them rejecting Andretti. So I think rocky is probably the best way I could put it. I think it's starting to mend in a way. I think maybe Ben Sulayem has realised that he's up for re-election soon, so he should probably stop making so much noise and annoying Formula One. But I think moving forwards, it does seem that they've found probably a much happier medium than previous years. Ben Sulayem, I think, has also now ceded to the fact that Andretti have been rejected, and he's not putting up as many public complaints as we saw earlier in the year. So I think at the start of this year, when I made my predictions for 2024, one of them was that the F1 and FIA relationship was going into a make or break year. And I think it has sort of played out that way. And I think they have found somewhat of a resolution to previous issues.
We've been focusing there on Formula One, but Liberty Media this year is in the process of expanding its influence across motorsport more broadly. That's through the acquisition of MotoGP. That's the biggest global motorcycling series. Has been owned for the last 10, 15 years or so by Dorna, Spanish-based promoter under license from the FIA. Till a few years ago, it was sort of thought MotoGP was in a fairly strong place. It had a very young audience. It was able to move into new markets. Its OEMs are generally pretty happy. Is that still the case, Cian, or has Liberty Media got another rescue job on its hands when it comes to the acquisition of MotoGP?
I'd say if Liberty Media bought MotoGP 2 or 3 years ago, I think that would have been probably considered a rescue job in my eyes. I think MotoGP struggled quite a bit with the retirement of Valentino Rossi. Obviously, an icon of the series. He's a name that even non-MotoGP fans exactly will have heard of. So losing a star of that power, I think, was tricky for the series. They have begun to bounce back recently, and I think that is what Liberty Media have seen, and that's the potential that they've seen. Liberty Media paid 4.2 billion euros for MotoGP. They clearly see the potential of the series and what it could go on to be. I think definitely not a rescue job now, but there is obviously so much more I think that series can do. And with what Liberty Media managed with Formula One, I don't think there's anyone better to try and take MotoGP to new heights.
When Liberty Media took over Formula One was definitely a rescue job. Like, we were talking about an organisation that didn't have a marketing department. The calendar was a lot smaller. It was relying on a increasingly diminishing amount of sponsors to fund it. Same with track hosts. It was relying on a pool of less and less attractive places to pay the bills. It was becoming sort of a bit of a, I wouldn't say a pariah, but like, it definitely wasn't popular in the same way. Now, like, MotoGP doesn't have those problems. What can Liberty Media do to advance MotoGP? It's not going to rip up the rulebook and be like, right, okay, we're now going to just do marketing because we haven't done that before. Is it new race locations? Is it focus on the US market, which has really clearly paid off for Formula One? What do you think it is?
I think we'll probably see actually a continuation of what MotoGP is currently doing. I think Liberty Media is quite aware of the fact that things are going in the right direction for the series. They don't, as you say, they don't need to rip up the rulebook. I think progression is happening at the series. I think just Liberty Media's knowledge and expertise will just give it that, extra helping hand. Obviously, Liberty Media recently sold additional shares to fund this acquisition. They clearly believe quite heavily in what they're doing. The shares amounted to about $825 million. I think overall, Liberty knows, I've said it a lot, the potential of MotoGP, and I think a lot of people can see that and what it could potentially become. Obviously, we do need to probably caveat this with the fact that this acquisition hasn't actually been officially signed off yet. There is, potential that this could be seen as monopolising in a way. Whether that gets past antitrust laws remains to be seen. In 2006, CVC obviously owned MotoGP and then bought Formula One and then was forced to sell MotoGP. So there is previous for this kind of thing not being allowed, but I think it's quite a different world today in terms of these all just being entertainment properties in a way. And I think it's hard to argue that there is a point of competition there between the two when they're competing with so many other things outside of sports itself. So I'm not hearing anything from within MotoGP that this won't go ahead. I think it's likely to be signed off around November time. So I think it's exciting. It's definitely exciting for the series. And I think I and a lot of other fans are excited to see what happens moving forward.
You're going to get as well John Malone, who is the chairman of Liberty Media and also Liberty Global, which has acquired a motorsport series of its own this year.
Yes, it has. I think we obviously need to say that Liberty Media and Liberty Global are two
very separate
companies, but Liberty Global has obviously purchased Formula E. Obviously need to mention as well that Liberty Global has actually been involved in Formula E since the beginning. It's just acquired a controlling stake. But I think it's, again, just a sign of these other motorsport series are clearly benefiting or beginning to benefit off of what has happened in Formula One over recent years. And we're now seeing these valuations being placed on series outside of Formula One. And I think Formula One is so often the gateway for people to get into motorsport, and then they branch out to other series. So I think it's clearly just overall quite a positive time in motorsport. And I think that Liberty Global acquisition of Formula E is just more proof of that.
And it does make John Malone the most powerful man in motorsport, should he actually care to have any influence on it.
If he wants to have that title, he's definitely got it.
Yeah. There is one smaller story I wanted to go into. The reason I wanted to touch on this, and I'm talking about Adidas here, is Adidas has enjoyed a bit of a bounce back in the last sort of 6 months or so. The brand has gone through a really tough time, mostly through mistakes of its own making, aligning itself far too closely with Kanye West, having to abandon that project when some very troubling things about the rapper emerged. That cost them a lot of money in stock that they'd already had made and couldn't sell. But there is a motorsport element to this. It sounds like Adidas is potentially about to become far more active on the track.
Absolutely, and I didn't want to spoil this story earlier when we were talking about Lewis Hamilton leaving Mercedes, but obviously Tommy Hilfiger is about to depart the team, but Mercedes are on the verge of announcing Adidas as a new sponsor for next season, which is obviously a significant acquisition for the team. Adidas are a huge brand, but obviously crucially also German, so there is this link up between the German Mercedes brand and the German Adidas brand. The synergies there make a lot of sense. And it's obviously Adidas's first involvement in Formula One. We're potentially going to see some further involvement as well. We're still at the rumour stage, but there may be a second team that Adidas supply when Audi join the grid in 2026. Still remains to be seen. Audi are still in the very early stages of agreeing their commercial partnerships. We've seen BP come on board as a fuel supplier with their subsidiary Castrol. But we could potentially see 2 teams out of the 10 Formula One teams being supplied by Adidas, which is quite a substantial presence for the brand.
Yeah, and it comes at a time when they've been upping their influence in other places too. Obviously, they lost the German national team kit deal. That was a rather big splash that Nike was able to make. I don't think Nike are entering motorsport anytime soon, but for Adidas, this seems like a new avenue to enter. And with 2 German teams being on the grid, you'd feel like that's definitely an attractive factor. They've also had a massive change of fortunes in the Premier League, and I know a team very close to your heart, Cian, is now wearing Adidas kits this year in Aston Villa. They obviously added Newcastle, but they've also got Leicester, who are promoted out of the Championship. And their most recent financials pointed to a bounce back for the brand. After missing projections for the last couple of years, they were sort of back ahead of them. There's been a change in strategy in terms of their D2C approach, and their marketing is almost actually returned to being more traditional sports marketing plan in focusing on the athletes rather than spending too much money on digital, which has been something has impacted both Nike and Adidas in recent years. There's a really fascinating feature I read on this on Medium. I might put it in the show notes about the impact of a mistake broadly in the sportswear market from brands thinking that going D2C and investing in digital marketing and looking to drive ads through that way was going to pay off. This is all sort of our hypotheses put together at a time when people were sat at home in the middle of the pandemic. Now, once people are out and about again, actually they kind of still want to go to retail stores, and your traditional athlete marketing still has a role to play here. And it, clearly for Adidas, it seems like motorsport has a role to play here. I felt like I just rambled for about 3 minutes there, but that's where we're finishing this week's pod. Cian, thank you very much for joining me. Always great to get your insight on the world of motorsport. As maybe listeners may have been able to tell from my line of questioning, I do not know as much about this as Cian does, so it's great to have a real expert in the studio. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me on, Tom. It's always a pleasure to return to the Sports Pro podcast.
Always good to have you, mate. And for listeners who want to hear more of Cian and the rest of the Black Book team, the Mike's Out podcast, it goes out every 2 weeks. If you want to watch it live, you can do that on the Black Book LinkedIn feed. That's usually out at about 2 p.m. UK time. The next one is on the 3rd of September. So you can tune in then, or if not, you'll be able to find it on all good podcasting platforms a little bit later in the week. And if you want to find Cian's writing, you can also do that on the Black Book website. Cian, anything else you want to plug while you're here?
It's just non-stop plugs for me at the moment, Tom. I'm loving it. But I think you've rounded it up quite well. Obviously, Mike's Out podcast, as you mentioned, every 2 weeks. Although, if you do want to listen to me, I'm actually not going to be on the next episode as I'm on holiday, but I'll be returning to regularly scheduled programming after that.
Okay, well, I'll be intrigued to see how the stand-in host does. Maybe, are you handing over to Tom Brown for that?
Tom Brown will be taking the reins, and I'm sure he'll do a very capable job.
I'm sure he will. A highly competent individual. Right, highly competent individuals out. That's it for this week's podcast. Thanks a lot. Bye.